Good afternoon, everybody. This is a note from one of your administrators. Wanted to let you know that there was a discussion between us all when we were organizing this session, and the question was asked whether we had ever covered in the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome's CACOR Live series any Canadian legislation, and the answer to that is yes, we have. It was on 01 May 2024, Zoom session number 195, which was about the Climate Aligned Finance Act that has been proposed for Canada. As far as I can tell, the latest update is about 6 months old. The act has not passed. In fact, it has not gone through all the readings that it needs in our parliament. So that's the status on the act. And you are welcome to find that on our website if you wish. Now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Kurz, our host for the day. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I met Brian over 2 decades ago at a one-day strategy conference in Washington, D.C. on population strategies, which we composed of people from around the world, actually, who were concerned with the lack of attention to the continuing growth of the human population. And the reason Brian was there and the reason I was there is that those numbers directly affect the growth of the economy. Anyway, Brian started his CASSE, C-A-S-S-E, as an association for developing a steady state economy. And he had been in and was still in the Fish and Wildlife Department of the United States government. And he had long ago realized that ecological health was required for human well-being. And in the process of trying to keep that front and center for his tenure there, he was increasingly bullied by those addicted to growth in the political establishment. So he had to struggle through that for quite a while he was still teaching at university. But now he is no longer working for the government, and he's more free to communicate this message freely. And I know that some of you had seen his earlier presentations, and he's going to continue with them now because they're trying to formalize a lot of this research into proposed legislation. So take it away, Brian.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to CACOR for hosting me. And I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time. When we scheduled it about half a year ago, I thought we'd be a little further along. CASSE, I'm talking about. I thought we'd be just a little bit further along in developing the Steady State Economy Act. We hit some bumps in the road, but we're definitely at a place where we want to start talking about it. So thanks again to CACOR. Now, so why a Steady State Economy Act? Because at this point in history, economic growth is causing more problems than it solves. Big problems, existential crises. And American economic policy is way outdated. And here in the 21st century, with people starting finally to think about sustainability, when you think about it in any kind of economic policy terms, you get to the conclusion that sustainability is a steady state economy. So reminding ourselves that neither growth nor degrowth are sustainable in any kind of long run. So that leaves as the sustainable alternative the steady state economy, hopefully with a relatively mildly fluctuating size and ideally around some optimal level. To define it in a few phrases, a steady state economy is a stabilized level of production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. That doesn't mean that we have the same goods and services produced year after year. Those change with consumer preference and technology, but the level of it as measured with GDP is what we're talking about. And you can measure it for sustainability purposes with GDP because GDP is causally correlated with the ecological footprint. So it's a sound measure for sustainability. And of course, a steady state economy entails a stabilized population and per capita consumption. At CASSE, we wear that concept on our logo, and we recognize that if we want to get to a steady state economy, it's a two-track road, and we've got the public and private sectors that have to run in parallel and sort of collaboratively, and those public and private sectors redound respectively, especially to public policy and consumer behavior, and which in turn deal largely with the production and consumption activities in an economy. Might be an even more apt metaphor to view it as two tracks, parallel tracks coming together, in the sense that production more or less equals consumption, with some of the Keynesian noted exceptions, but yeah, production is pretty much consumption. And of course, certainly demand drives supply, but also the rules of supply are really important. Things like environmental regulations and labor laws. Now, some people would question whether or not we should be putting so much effort into policy development yet, because you don't hear in the mainstream media much call for something other than growth when it comes to macroeconomic considerations. So, but it's kind of like the chicken and the egg thing, which ought to come first. And ever since we were founded in 2003, as Steve alluded to, why people back then were telling us it's one thing to be complaining about limits to growth and the conflict between growth and all these other things. But what about the policies then? What are you proposing? So we have, in a general sense, proposed a lot of policy reforms over the years. Now we're finally at that stage where we're piecing it together into comprehensive legislation. And then, there's sort of the idea that build it and they will come, develop the policy. And I think we'll start to develop constituencies, alliances, and interested members of Congress and other politicians. And then, of course, politics itself can change really quickly, as we all know. So we want to be ready and waiting for maybe when the next Helene precipitates, so to speak, a real serious conversation about limits to growth. And of course, public policy is handled from the local through international levels. And at times we have gotten involved at each of these four levels, but right now our focus is at county and federal levels. And there's a lot of interplay there. We're going to be focused at the federal level, but I just want to have one slide about our county project as well. We call it the Keep Our Counties Great campaign, to juxtapose our effort with that notion of making America great again. It was always America the beautiful. You want to keep your county great? Well, then why don't we try to keep the bulldozer of GDP at bay? And CACOR hosted Dave Rollo as well for a talk about the Keep Our Counties Great campaign. And, the policy instrument where it manifests, where the campaign reaches success, hopefully more and more, is the county comprehensive plan that gets ironed out at the county commission meetings. But today we're going to focus on the Steady State Economy Act. We've had it in mind for a long time. We were originally calling it the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. That's what I called it in Supply Shock back in 2013. And we've had some articles in the Steady State Herald on it. And we called it that because we wanted to sort of deliver the message that these are wholesale amendments to the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978, or FEBGA, which still, almost 50 years later now, is like the central economic policy of the US. If there is a central economic policy, it's FEBGA. You know, FEBGA itself was pretty old when it was signed by President Carter, because it itself constituted amendments to the 1946 Employment Act. And that, of course, would have never come into play at all if it weren't for Keynes' work after World War II and during. And then decades later, when FEBGA was passed, it was sort of a fruition of Keynesian thinking in government, both in fiscal and you might say especially in monetary matters. So FEBGA got the Fed fully into the growth game in 1978. All right, so of course, this is the 21st century. We're bumping right up to limits to growth. The signs are all over. So we badly need steady statesmanship, not growthmanship. And that's why we need a new iteration of central economic policy, not central planning. That's different, but a coordinated type of central policy with a unified approach to the macroeconomic goals. So these are the table of this is the table of contents for the Steady State Economy Act. So far, we've kind of settled upon these 14 major sections, and they take the form of a more or less typical organic type of act that's fairly comprehensive in scope. And after the table of contents, we've got the findings and declarations of Congress. We've got definitions. We have executive adoption of steady state goals. Got two really heavy duty central pillars on fiscal and monetary policy that we're working on right now. Have a section on sustainable immigration, because of course you have to have a stabilized population for a steady state economy, for a sustainable economy. And now in the 21st century, for decades, given momentum, that is a matter of immigration policy. And CACOR has heard our basic approach to that in the past. You don't want to tighten borders until you're undergoing the transition to a steady state economy, or you make global enemies, is it in a nutshell. But when you're passing a Steady State Economy Act, you certainly want to stabilize the population, and you've got to deal with the right amount of regulation at the border. Trade and capital mobility, labor and income, housing and transportation, all the main economic activity themes that typically come up when you talk about economic growth. Caps, except some that apply specifically to getting off the growth path and moving toward a steady state, like capping and trading, certain economic incentives for those purposes. And then sections on prohibitions and penalties and enforcement. And most of these sections have subsections, but these are the 14 mains. I want to spend a little bit of time on the findings and declarations. Personally, I think with an act like this, a paradigm shifting sort of bill, that the findings and declarations are the most important section of the entire thing, because it kind of lays the groundwork for all. It's telling you what's being changed from the past, and it's telling the government and the public what we're going to be doing in terms of governmental management going forward. So I just want to go through a few of the findings. There are probably about 10 of them. We're just going to go through the first three, where the first one is that Congress finds that economic growth requires a growing human population, increasing per capita consumption, or both. Just to remind everybody involved exactly what economic growth is. And then secondly, Congress finds that consistent with the natural sciences, including basic principles of physics and biology, there are limits to economic growth within and among nations. And third, Congress finds that there is a fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, including the maintenance of clean air and water, productive soils and biological diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So the way I want to summarize these findings is that they're essentially a recapping of the CASSE position on economic growth, which has been around since 2003. And that points to the fact that we have sort of a built-in constituency. That's our signatories. And that's the endorsement, the organizations, about 300 organizations that have endorsed. In other words, they've endorsed the findings of Congress, of the theoretical Congress that we're building toward communicating with. And what we also have on our side are two really key allies. That's sound science and common sense. I think one of the reasons you don't hear a lot more talk about legislative reform to get off the growth path and move toward a steady state is it just hadn't been proposed by anybody else. I mean, there's been the vague talk about limits to growth and the need to do something, but no talk about public policy at the federal level to actually accomplish that. I think as we bring that to bear, the common sense is going to kick in all around. And then these findings, of course, they set a real clear stage for the declarations, which is maybe even more important. And I would like to go through each of these. There's 7 of them, so please be patient. Take a few minutes. So firstly, the Congress declares that it is heretofore the policy of the nation to undertake a gradual but certain transition from the goal and pursuit of economic growth to the goal and pursuit of a sustainable, steady state economy with stabilized or mildly fluctuating population and per capita consumption as generally indicated by GDP. Second, Congress declares that the transition to a steady state economy must be undertaken with every intent and effort to achieve and maintain the full employment of the labor force, consistent with environmental protection and other aspects of economic sustainability, including a balanced budget and the effective control of inflation. Third, Congress declares that the president's cabinet, Council of Economic Advisors, Federal Reserve, and federal agency directors will immediately cease and desist from developing strategies and initiatives to grow or stimulate the economy. Existing policies, programs, and projects designed explicitly to grow or stimulate the economy shall not be extended beyond fiscal year 2030 or beyond the designated sunset date. Fourth, Congress declares that the Congressional Research Service, collaborating with the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors, will review and summarize the federal agency mission statements, goals, objectives, policies, programs, and practices designed for GDP growth, producing a report on federal growth incentives no later than 30 April 2031. And we've helped with this already. We've summarized federal agency mission statements and goals. A little more on that in a bit. Fifth, Congress declares that a commission on economic sustainability is hereby established to include the EPA administrator and the secretaries of Ag, Energy, and Commerce, chaired by the Secretary of the Interior, to estimate and monitor environmentally sustainable levels of population and socially optimal levels of GDP. The commission will produce a report on sustainable population and optimal GDP no later than 31 August 2031. This is the second from last one. The commission chair, with counsel of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Secretary of Commerce, Federal Reserve Chair and Secretary of the Treasury, drawing on the report on federal growth incentives and the report on sustainable population and optimal GDP, and pursuant to the framework provided in subsequent sections herein in the Steady State Economy Act, will develop and deliver to the president no later than 31 August 2032 a 25-year steady state transition plan detailing and scheduling the adjustments, modifications, additions, and deletions necessary to establish a system of government operations most conducive to a steady state economy at an estimated optimal level of GDP. And finally, seventh, Congress declares that the president, cabinet secretaries, and federal agency directors shall not overlook the existence, neglect the enforcement, or underfund the performance of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, NEPA, or any other of the nation's environmental laws or regulations on grounds that said laws or regulations may interfere with the workings of the economy or slow the rate of GDP growth. So thank you for your patience in hearing me out on those. It's a crucial section. It's the one that we want to survive in whole more than any other. But these are some of the other sections that we have at least developed subsections of, or in some cases completed. And then we have it with the dashed circles, sections that we have are incidentally developing with some of our other CASSE work, including some of the existing sections. I'll tell you what I mean here in just a minute when we talk about the process of developing legislation like this. So we're drafting these sections as what we call feeder bills, because each of them will feed into the full Steady State Economy Act. Now, that's not to say there's going to be 14 feeder bills. At the latest count, it's going to be maybe about 30, 31, 32, 33, somewhere in there, feeder bills. And this allows us to build congressional support one issue at a time. Now, it's typically the case for a nonprofit or a corporation or an interested party, when they want legislation to pass on the Hill, they're not going to draft it themselves. They're going to bring to the Hill a policy brief, and then someone on some congressional member's staff or committee staff will draft the legislation pursuant to the aims identified in the policy brief. We're going the extra mile with this very challenging legislation because it's so challenging. We don't think that there's enough shifting a paradigm that's transpired just yet on Capitol Hill, where we can lay down a policy brief on a table and leave and expect to hear a month later that they've translated that into legislation. So we're doing it ourselves and producing accompanying policy briefs. And in the process of doing this, we're identifying, and we will be identifying much more rapidly in the coming year and a half, the potential sponsors of the full Steady State Economy Act. And meanwhile, with some of these feeder bills, there's some meaningful policy reform in the works, or there should be. And these are some of the feeder bills. We've developed a Commission on Economic Sustainability Act that flows right out of the declarations of Congress. Sustainable Missions Act, Luxury Cap Act, Salary Cap Act, a Mileage Fee Act, 32-hour Work Week Act, and these pertain to sections 4, 5, 9, and 10, respectively. So I think what I wanted to point out here once again is that in the process, we're talking about the process here. So when we develop one of these feeder bills, it's quite likely that it's going to contribute to the final SSEA full-fledged section on definitions and prohibitions and so on. And I want to at least talk briefly about one example, the Salary Cap Act. This happens to be one of the feeder bills for which there is low-hanging political fruit. And this is one of the main reasons we're taking the feeder bill approach, because we realize there's no political viability in this Congress for a transition to a steady state economy. That's a lot of the other CASSE work is toward that end. You know, you might say supply and demand in a different sense, political and policy supply and political demand for public policy. But some of these feeder bills will have fantastic starting points and precedents. We build upon these precedents, like you've probably heard of Bernie Sanders and the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act of 2024, for example. Well, we have something to offer Sanders and his co-sponsors. In fact, we're proposing that there are sector-specific caps across the board of the economy, sector-specific, and using the North American Industrial Classification System main level sector. There's about a dozen of them. And we acknowledge that, you know, somebody flipping burgers at McDonald's, they're not on the same scale, the same pay scale as, you know, corporate and governmental managers and so on. But there have to be limits placed somewhere. And so we've got a formula in there, basically 1.8 times what the existing 90th percentile in those NAICS sectors are, if you must know the detail. It's spelled out in the act. And what that amounts to, by the way, with this managerial cap of 400K is that nobody in this country is going to have a salary greater than the president's. And I don't know about you, but I think that there are a lot of people out there for which that would resonate. Here we all are, hundreds of millions, voting a person into political leadership of the entire nation. I think we should expect that there shouldn't be football players and CEOs and singers getting 20 times as much as the president, probably no more than that. So there's that element of our Salary Cap Act. And it's a prohibitive policy, whereas most efforts these days in the last couple decades, you might as well say, toward any type of reform like this are really rest upon taxation. Well, all right. So when we developed legislation, a feeder bill, there's sort of two co-products. There's the bill itself. Here's the beginning of the Salary Cap Act. And here again, you see you're going to have some findings of Congress. A lot of our feeder bills will have similar or in some cases identical findings. At the end of the day, the end of the years, when the full Steady State Economy Act is ready, then some of these findings will be rolled up. Same thing with definitions. And then we publish a Herald article. That's our blog, the Steady State Herald. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And that's where we introduce to the public the feeder bill. And in the process of doing that and our networking on the Hill, you know, and just our general research on what's going on in Congress, we can identify pretty quickly for some of these feeder bills our allies. It's certainly the case with the Salary Cap Act. We've got natural friends and allies, Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, Chris Van Hollen, and so on in the Senate. Same in the House, where Barbara Lee introduced this bill the House version. But, James McGovern and Pramila Jayapal and Raul Grijalva, and, there are a lot of members of Congress that we can get the ball rolling with via the salary cap concept and act. Well, in terms of the broader Steady State Economy Act project, it's quite a beast. I mean, we've got to draft all these feeder bills, the 30 some, and accompany them with Herald articles and policy briefs. Got to maintain all these things so that they flow together. They're not too redundant, but yet they're self-sufficient. That's a challenge. And then we're kind of juggling all these documents. We have to modify the table of contents occasionally. And at the same time, we're trying to build alliances. We feel we have a great friend in CACOR. We have friends with our 300 organizational endorsements and so on. But we need a lot more. And, at some point, we're going to need some of the big ones too. And, that blends right into the act of political outreach. And I say outreach versus lobbying. We have to be very careful. We're a 501c3. We can do a limited amount of lobbying, but it's not like we can be doing more than a limited amount of lobbying. But at the very least, we can draft legislation till the cows come home, put that onto the desk of members of Congress and congressional staff that are starting to get it about the existential crises posed as you get into bumping against limits to growth. Oh, did I mention we happen to have a position available to help with this work? We have a policy specialist position. It may end up being a little more than just an entry-level position. Obviously depends on the applications we receive and so on, but in any event, this is a professional full-time salaried position with benefits. And we have a fairly competitive package for nonprofits in the Beltway. Now we'll consider a teleworker for this position, but all else equal, of course, we're going to favor applications coming from the Beltway because the Capitol Hill traffic ideally is a significant part of their job. All right, these are some of the challenges that we face in finishing this project, finalizing the Steady State Economy Act. Once again, there's a lot of overlapping materials, especially with definitions and penalties, but there's a lot of overlapping material in general, and so that it's just a challenge. We'll deal with it. And then there's also the choice you face from the get-go whether or not to develop what we might term in this context organic legislation, which is sort of like starting with a clean slate versus code-ready content, where you're making the job a lot easier for the Office of the Law Revision Council that maintains the United States Code. You're determining what laws on the books as codified need to be amended. But the way we're looking at it is our approach with the organic legislation. It's a solid compromise between this code-ready content and what most outfits do, which is just plopping a policy brief on the table. We do have to kind of wrestle with the contrast between prohibitive policy and tax policy. They ought to amount to the same, but we feel like limits to growth is such a serious thing that things like exorbitant salaries and wanton waste, those ought to be outlawed. There ought to be criminal penalties that apply to those existential crisis baiting types of behaviors. So we tend toward prohibitive policy more than other organizations, but believe me, there's going to be plenty of tax policy in the Steady State Economy Act too. There is in some of the feeder bills already. Another challenge that we face is when exactly to reveal to the member of Congress or the committee that, hey, you know what this is really all about is building toward a steady state economy. It's not like we're pulling some surprise. I mean, you give them the CASSE business card and they have the basic idea from the get-go. Like I say, we wear our mission on our logo. So it's there all the time pretty much, but the emphasis on it, you know, when to go for that emphasis, that's a real political strategy concern. Here's kind of a timeline of the project. We hope to have all of the feeder bills completed by March. They may not all be published by then with their co-product of Herald article, but we want to have them in-house at least pretty well drafted by then, because we'd like to roll out the full Steady State Economy Act in late 2025, hopefully before the fall really starts. And then throughout much of 2025, and especially beyond this rollout, that's when we'll be focusing more on the alliance building, the networking on Capitol Hill, and really striving to get some of the feeder bills introduced in Congress. And then here, I mean, this is just a shot in the dark. If we had to place a bet in Vegas right now, I don't think many of us would bet much at all on a date of 2030 for the Steady State Economy Act to be introduced by a member of Congress. I had to put something there, and you know, there was that point earlier that politics can change pretty quickly. So and then of course the general concept is that your accuracy of forecasting is going to diminish as the frame of time goes outward. So whatever this takes basically is the deal for us. A lot of it depends on you yourself. I mean, if you guys, if the people that assemble for a topic like this don't pitch in, not to pressure anybody, but you know, who will? So along those lines, you know, and to help, there's some really simple steps toward doing that. And I just have a couple more slides here. Of course, you can join CASSE, and we really encourage you to do that. Donations, of course, help. Volunteer, though. You know, we got a lot of really smart, experienced, knowledgeable, capable people in CACOR and CACOR's guests and friends. And some of you have significant experience in drafting legislation where we could really use some help. And please volunteer to liaise for the studies for CASSE and in developing more allies among you know, the organizations out there in civil society, as well as onto Capitol Hill. And once again, you know, don't overlook this policy specialist position in case you're out there looking for something really, really meaningful toward making a difference in the 21st century. So that's about as far as I was able to get, and actually that brings us to approximately the right time anyway. And so if nobody minds, I'd like to leave this slide on while we conclude the talk. Try to take a quick snap of it with your phone so that you'll find it easier in the minutes after the talk to join CASSE. And while you're at it, be sure to select your membership gift book. We have a phenomenal new book that you can pre-order. It's not published yet, but it's called The Age of Hugh Machines, Big Tech versus I forgot the exact subtitle, I apologize, but it's an outstanding composition about the threats we face by AI. And a lot of this AI and robotics stuff itself is a function of pro-growth, perpetual growth notions, and policy. And the book Hugh Machines does a great job of describing how it is a function of that. So you may want to get Hugh Machines. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. I've got a list of maybe a dozen people who have asked questions. Some of you have asked multiple questions. So I'll do my best. If I miss somebody, type in the chat. I'm starting with Fernando. I don't have a last name. That was an organization next to that. And Fernando had a question and I think maybe one other comment. So Fernando, are you there? You have to unmute yourself.
It's Fernanda, and I'm with
Fernanda, I apologize.
All good.
Well, yes. You know, well, please ask away. Brian is available.
Thank you. That was lovely, Brian. We've emailed back and forth, still waiting to have a catch-up meeting. The Alliance for Just Money, we work on monetary reform and getting to the real root cause of why we have growth in the economy. And the root cause is that our bank money is created as debt. So we have a legislation to fix that called the American Monetary Reform Act. And yeah, we'd love to collaborate. And I was just wondering if you guys already connected with donut economics, because a lot of the talk revolved around GDP and kind of reframing the goal of not growth, but getting to our basic needs and steadiness. So thank you.
Well, Brian, did you get a question?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Fernanda. Thank you. Definitely. We're and I do remember corresponding, and we want to get back into that thread and take a closer look at the American Monetary Reform Act. Maybe that's going to be a central element in in our section on monetary policy. So and then in terms of donut economics, yeah, we've had some involvement with them, but not on a regular basis. Kate Rayworth was a guest on my podcast a couple years ago. We were a little bit disappointed in the viewing GDP growth agnostically, as it was put back then. But I think that was maybe an understated approach in order to get a foot in the door. So, we're okay with that. And they've been very, very successful, especially in Northern Europe with donut economics. So thanks for the great question and comment.
Okay, next on my list is George Carpot. Are you there, George?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, great. So basically the question, I think, is fairly self-evident. We are currently in a resource overshoot in terms of our environmental global footprint, consuming much more resources annually than the planet can produce annually. So I would like a few words from Brian on at what GDP level do you see the steady state, and how would we get there practically? I guess you've answered some of it through lobbying government, etc. But at what level do you see the steady state?
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic question. A super rough back of the envelope calculation would start with the factoid that overshoot day is back into July at this point. So let's say it's the beginning of July. So then all else equal, we're looking at the need for degrowth toward a sustainable steady state economy. But at CASSE, we've long had a strategic and sort of a common sense approach as well of one paradigm shift at a time. And we feel that the Steady State Economy Act is ultimately going to lead public and policymakers to recognize that we can't just get off the growth path and move directly into a steady state economy, but rather get off the growth path, think about it a while, and then accept and possibly even pursue significant degrowth toward a much more sustainable, at a much more optimal for the long run level of steady state. So that's the short answer, but that's one of the reasons that we envision such a primary role for the U.S. Department of the Interior. I bet they would be shocked to hear this, that anybody would be, but they're going to hear it. And some of my old colleagues are there, and they're probably aware of this. The reason they would be so important is that they have a lot of the resources and programs in place to be able to undertake a wholesale monitoring of the ecological footprint and map it out, with the USGS in particular, and the phenomenal mapping capabilities and resource databases they have. The Department of the Interior is like a gigantic bottle of info with the tiniest little bottleneck that hardly anything ever seeps out of. So they would be brought to bear, starting with the secretary in that Commission on Economic Sustainability.
Just as a quick follow-up, what would the election of Trump do to your schedule?
Well, let me count the years.
Yeah, very
But
good.
I shouldn't take that flippantly, and I want to warn people. I guess people out there realize this, but it may not help to have a little pep talk. If Kamala Harris is elected, that's no silver bullet. I mean, she has expressed the program. I always felt there would be some hope there by virtue of the fact that her mother was a biological scientist and her father was an economist who was, I haven't looked at a lot of his papers in that, but he was essentially a critic of neoclassical growth theory. Now, whether that critique extended all the way to recognizing limits to growth and the need for a steady state, maybe not. But, she probably grew up with some conversations around the table there earlier on, and it's not hopeless. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. David Pollock had a question and a comment, but he has left. So if anybody wants to know what he had to say, you can look in the chat later. And the next I have is Anton Camerata, and Erwin Dreesen is on deck. Anton, are you available?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent.
Okay, my question really is around the cultural aspects of this, which drive the economic aspects of a sustainable or steady state economy. It seems like what really is needed here is some sort of a mass motivational tool or vision that would encourage people to adopt this viewpoint in the world. Right now, we're dealing with an economic system that's, basically oriented around around a certain number of families, like around 50 or 60 families, and inherited wealth becomes the primary goal of society, maintaining that. And so to get a shift, what kind of, I guess, definition can we have around what would be an optimal standard of living? Because I believe this is also related to some non-material aspects of what we're talking about here.
Right. Well, you know, some of us have at various points in our career taken a crack at that sort of challenge. I remember back in 1999 and 2000, I wrote that book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and I tried to blend Darwinian and Veblenian and Maslowian theories into what I call the steady state revolution, whereby we start to recognize conspicuous consumption as just bad behavior, to put it simply. And if you could get that ball rolling, that when I alluded or mentioned earlier on the rapidity with which politics can change, if you could get that ball rolling, that would surely be an example of that, because if the proposal there was not to start pointing fingers at each other for, you know, for driving a car or, you know, going to a restaurant a couple times. The idea was to look first at the most problematic scenarios, the upper 1 percentile in personal consumption expenditures. And if you do that and are successful, like sort of anti-smoking was successful in pointing to the conspicuous smoker, and anti-slavery was successful in pointing to the excesses of slave owners. So if you could manage to do that with consumption in general, where would you wind up? You would totally reset the rules of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Instead of the conspicuous consumer gaining that Darwinian advantage and that Veblenian leisure class behavior, it would be castigated. And that would change. It wouldn't change everybody in the 1 percentile. There are some real sociopaths there, surely. But it would change a substantial proportion of those in that castigated class, if you will. And then what happens? Well, you still have a 1 percentile. They're a little bit lower to start, but you could see how you would have a trickle-down effect in that what I called it was the liquidating class, the castigation of the liquidating class. But, you know, Anton, I finally, in my case, I decided I ought to stick to the science, the natural sciences, and the policy development, because I certainly wasn't getting very far with the castigation of the liquidating class, especially after 9/11 happened, and it totally changed the nature of the American political game for a long time.
Well, I think
Okay.
there's a lot of fear in the United States, and I think that the fear factor here of what exactly is being proposed. Am I going to have to give up my house, my job, my clothes? What does it really mean to achieve this in terms of a transition? I think is necessary. So maybe what we need is a sort of a concomitant, a massive propaganda campaign, well funded for years. Shifting the idea of what it means to have an optimal standard of living.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Erwin Dreesen, you're up, and Jim Schulman is on deck.
Hi, Brian. Glad to see
Hey, Erwin.
you. As you know, I've been a long-time supporter and subscriber to the CASSE philosophy for everything except the monetary policy, but we won't go into that. My question was on immigration and how you see that And I see somebody, Rob Harding, answered that you actually did an article on that 2 years ago in the Herald, which I'm afraid I don't recall. So perhaps you can comment on how you see the immigration issue relative to a steady state.
Yeah, that's a great question and certainly extremely relevant and timely. So the way we approach it, which I feel is fairly unique, and whenever we get the minutes to talk about it, people tend to concur. So I'm glad you asked. So we say that the fact is, if you want to move toward a steady state economy, by definition, you have to stabilize population. But if you're hell bent on GDP growth, you're not moving toward a steady state economy. And in fact, we probably, the collective, we need to make a bigger deal of the fact that as long as the overriding domestic policy goal is GDP growth, good luck getting any sort of population or immigration stabilization policy very far along. So we say that we need to gradually tighten borders, but it's a big but only as we announce to the world that we recognize, we have declared limits to growth, and we have declared that we're moving off the growth path toward a sustainable, steady state economy. Then all of a sudden it becomes not only technically essential to tighten borders, not all the way, because we wouldn't even have a stabilized population if we kept everybody out of the country. But we'd want to keep a substantial percentage of the current level of immigration. And not only would it be technically required, but it would be immediately politically viable. Because we're saying to the world, you know what, we're not doing this to hurt anybody. In fact, when we get this steady state economy established, one of our main goals is to participate in steady statesmanship and international diplomacy and establish an aid-in-place fund to help the peoples that are desperate to emigrate from climate hit places, for example, and just dire poverty. So that's our approach in a nutshell. It's to greatly lessen the rate of immigration, but only as a co-campaign, a co-policy with the transition to a steady state.
Well, it's certainly a logical point of view, but it clearly looks many decades ahead. For the next several decades, for sure, no matter, even if you are incredibly successful by having the act introduced by 2030, the American or North American standard of living is always going to be much higher than that in many parts of the world. And so the attraction of immigrating to America by legal or illegal means is going to remain. So that push for increased population is going to be with us for decades ahead.
Now that's why I think now is the time to start talking about it more and more, because there is a lot of momentum that we have to overcome.
Okay, somebody is suggesting that I missed George Karpat, but I believe he spoke number 2. But George, are you still there?
Still here. I already had my question. Thank you.
That's what I thought. Okay, so Jim Schulman, you're up now, and Bill Stowe or Stuff is on next. Jim Shulman. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for a really plain spoken, clear analysis of things that need to be done. But I'm curious, this is the second question I put into the chat, actually. I'm curious if we can't achieve a similar end to this kind of legislative work by focusing on restricting or better encouraging economic activity to turn inward into regional economies. Get away from the globalized economy and focus on regions and meeting their basic needs first and foremost. We could still have luxury goods that are traded, but only after basic needs are met. Your thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with the first part, not so much with the second part. There's partial agreement there, but certainly the first part, as I'm sure you know, probably better than we do, the whole concept of globalization economically is based on the very old classical idea of comparative advantage, which when you think about for very long, you recognize that capitalizing upon comparative advantages kind of amounts to an ever more milking of the cow of resources of the planet Earth. And we don't want to do that anymore. So, right, it would definitely be a move in the right direction to localize, and the step toward localization is regionalization. And it makes a lot more sense for a lot of institutional reasons and for certain types of infrastructural maintenance and so on. So I agree with that. The part about having luxury goods, well, there's the semantics issue there. What constitutes luxury goods? I feel like we can't have too much of those because the ecological footprint is just too big. And so if you want to trim the fat, if you will, of a national or global economy, it seems to me the place to start is luxury goods and also obvious waste.
Okay. Now, Bill Stuff, you're on. Bill, are you there?
I believe he's left.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to cross him off. Greg Holloway is up then, and then John Legg next. Greg Holloway. Well, maybe he's gone too. Okay, John. John Legg, are you there?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Brian, thank you very much for that presentation. As a non-expert in economics, I think your plan to formalize the principles of a steady state economy seems to be a radical idea. So because I spent 31 years in the Foreign Service, I immediately turned to international views on this. And so my question is, would you please talk about the international implications of the plan, and have you already had consultations? It says start my video. Well, for what it's worth, there we are. So have you already had consultations, and if so, with how many other countries or foreign services, and what has been the reaction internationally? There we are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the short answer is yes, we have, not a lot. We have been involved at the UN with the Harmony with Nature initiative that came out of Bolivia originally, and it's excellent work that they've done for quite a while now in raising awareness about limits to growth. We've been involved in Ukraine, not since the war, but earlier, in developing what we ended up calling the Kiev communique, which is a pushback against the Nord 2 pipeline on grounds, not so much of pipeline impact itself, but all of the activity, economic bloating that would result from that additional gush of energy. So yeah, things like that we have been involved in, but like I mentioned very early in the talk, we have made the conscious decision with our limited resources to focus at county and federal levels in the USA, recognizing, however, that especially the federal legislation, we see a future for that in other overdeveloped countries as well. So we hope that folks like yourself actually can help us with that to, get that circulating in other countries. At one time we had sort of well, we still have a vision, it's on the back burner, but a convention on economic sustainability. That would be the place where steady statesmanship would be most relevant and most focused upon. That's probably for somebody, a little bit longer in tooth than me.
Well, it's probably the longest teeth here in this group. I would suggest that you should start with an organization called the OECD, and that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'm told that Canada was a founding member. It was formed in 1960, and it has quite a broad mandate. So, the Canadian representative, I'm not even sure where the headquarters is. I suspect it may be Paris, but I really don't know. But it's been around since 1960 and does a lot of generally positive work to build a better global economy and with relations between countries economically. So I better shut up there because I don't know that much about economics compared to the real experts. But it seems to me a very good place to start. And I'd be quite happy to put you in touch with people if I still have contacts with my own advanced age. They're getting fewer and fewer in terms of my former career colleagues. But thank you very much. And needless to say, as a CACOR member, I'm very, very in favor of all the work you're doing, because we have to do something to stabilize. And of course, well, limits to growth, that says it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, Claude Butner is up, and then Richard Vanderyak is on deck.
Actually, I just was making comments. I don't have a strong question. I will pass on to the next person. Thank you so much.
That's fine. I interpreted some of your writing as a question. Richard Vanderyak, if you're there, and then Maxine Leitner is next.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That was good talk. I just have, when I listen to your talk, it seems to me a lot of what you're directing your activity towards is economic activity, though, but not taking into account as part of the equation the effect on the environment, which I think has to be measured and then taken into, like last week, Trevor Hancock gave a really good talk on on how, this has to be taken into account as part of the equation, and we can't be just measuring GDP, as you have said. But then we also have to measure the effect on the climate. I mean, you look at the the economic activity of the fossil fuel companies, that's a perfect example. But anyway, that is just a question, comment, slash. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's kind of ironic because, most of my career up until 5 years ago, no, man, now it's like 6 or 7 years ago, was as a wildlife biologist and a wildlife manager and wildlife administrator or conservation planner for various governments, ending up in the headquarters of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But I have to say that I found you have a zillion people out there doing that, measuring the impacts of this and that activity, and hardly anyone even mentioning that all of those impacts have this single or central origin of the pursuit of GDP growth.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that's why, CASSE, that's our focus, and we recognize the importance of, like I mentioned, the USGS maybe 8-9 minutes ago, their work to measure and monitor the ecosystems of the United States, the species of the U.S., in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of colleges and universities as well, and other agencies, National Science Foundation, and so on. Yeah, it's important, but frankly, we're disappointed in them because they have never, to my knowledge, and I tried, this is my last CACOR talk was on this very topic, trying to get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which ought to be a global leader in raising awareness of the biggest challenge to wildlife conservation, GDP growth. They muffle the people that attempt to deliver that message, to speak truth to power about limits to growth. So I don't know, there's no silver bullet there in terms of bringing scientific credentials and production to bear. We just got to keep pushing at it. I mean, now we do have some like ecological economists at USGS, so on. So I haven't lost hope, but that's to answer it.
Are you a charitable organization? Because at least in Canada, if you can, then you can lobby politicians, right? And it sounds like you already have been, but certainly that provides you a strength. I'm not sure if CASSE's charitable or non-charitable.
Yeah, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and with that status, we can do very limited lobbying, and we're a small nonprofit, so we don't have a major file at the IRS, probably hardly on their radar for these kinds of purposes, but we get on it very fast if we lobby per se, aggressively. So we're careful of how we use the term lobbying versus political outreach and policy development.
Okay. Unless Brian has another comment. Okay. Maxine Leichter, if you're there.
Thank you. By the way, I'm both a U.S. and a Canadian citizen living in Canada.
So am I, by the way.
So first of all, I want to encourage you to put your act on your website because I'd like to read it. And secondly, I think reducing the use of resources, especially mining and petroleum products, that we have to make products either fixable or recyclable. And I know there's been some legislation on that, the right to repair legislation. I don't know if that's state or federal, but that sort of thing seems like it might be a policy initiative that might be feasible at this time. It's just so frustrating when you've got a perfectly good vacuum cleaner, for example, that I can't get a part to fix. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that we should have some penalizing of the programmed the obsolescence of goods. And it's become a huge problem with appliances, definitely in the US. And so thank you for bringing that up. I'm making notes here. And if you are involved in an organization that, addresses the long-lived incentives for long-lived products, then please get in touch with us. One thing I may add that we're favorable to recycling and so on, but we don't place a lot of stock in the concept of circular economy because we're hardcore dailyist steady state economists here at CASSE. We recognize the macroeconomic process as a matter of throughput, energy and materials, products and wastes, pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics. So we feel that some sectors, like take aluminum, for example, there is a lot of there are a lot of resources that can be saved by a well-developed recycling program and policy. So we're definitely in favor of that, but we do kind of push back when we hear that phrase circular economy as if it's a macroeconomic concept, because it's not. What we offer to the world is what we call the triangular economy. It's got a trophic structure, just like the economy of nature that starts with the plants, upon which you can have primary consumers, upon which you can have secondary consumers. It's the same with the human economy. It's got a trophic structure, and the energy and material throughput goes up through that trophic structure, and goods are consumed along the way, and waste is generated along the way. And that's why there's got to be a limit on the scale, the size of the economy, which I'm sure you know, but I just wanted to make sure that we didn't leave anyone doubting that in any way.
Okay, the last person I know who is on the list is Peter Kanaga. And Meg Sears had made what she thought was a question or two, but she said she had to leave. I don't know if she's still there or not, but Peter Kanaga, I'm not saying all these names as they should be. And that would be our last commenter.
Well, thank you. And the name that's pronounced Kanagi.
Okay.
So I work quite a bit I live in Oregon, and I work quite a bit in the state legislature on land use stuff. And I've been a member of CASSE for a long time, and it's right where I am philosophically. And, I noticed at the start of your talk, you talked about working at the federal level and at the county level, but you didn't mention anything about at the state level. And it just seems to me that there's potential at the state legislature level. And anyway, I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The main reason we haven't gotten involved often with state policy is, first of all, there's 50 of them. Well, there's 3,000 some counties, but the state houses seem a little more off limits than the county commissions, and the counties have that very specific policy instrument called the County Comprehensive Plan, And also, Peter, a big part of the answer is that we find that, and I've experienced this firsthand with those gag orders I had in the federal government. There's very little room to even talk about limits to growth, we find that to be pretty much the case also at state level politics, but not in the county newspapers. It's all over those local papers. And it's very explicit, you know, it's put in terms of growth versus, you know, not growth. So that's the other reason. But if we had a bigger endowment, let's say, and more staff, we certainly would get involved in these, if for no other reason, and it's a natural bridge from local to federal levels. But keep us apprised of what's going on in Oregon, and we'll be, you know, happy to try to collaborate there.
You know, it seems to me the way Oregon's comp plans, county comp plans work in the state legislature, particularly around land use, a lot of those decisions are made at the state legislature. The big decisions that affect growth and consumption in our state are made at the state level and not at the county level. And, you know, I guess I would be, if there were other people in Oregon that were interested in working on this in the legislature, I'd be happy to connect with them and try to get something going, because there is potential, I think, to do stuff in our state legislature.
Okay, great. We'll be coming to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Art has repeated Meg's question. Meg had to leave. And I'm going to read it, Brian. A concept we've used to address overshoot is essentiality, which I've never heard of exactly, but I think I know what she means. When making choices at every level, from personal to regulatory, governmental, and industrial. Is this helpful? And if so, how do you communicate what should be a hard stop? Well, I can't exactly understand what she means, but I guess she's looking for hard metrics of some sort in deciding on your approach to optimality, which to me is a floater, because that depends on changing external conditions. In my understanding, it's not the external conditions aren't static. Well, anyway, you can make a comment on it.
Yeah, the essentiality, I mean, to me, that connotes the focus on citizens having the necessary means for a reasonable standard of living and taking care of that before a lot of focus is put on, like, you know, other aspects of economic well-being. But I missed the phrase where there's kind of a definition thrown in there of.
She said when making choices at every level, from personal, then she goes into regulatory, governmental, and industrial. Well, essentials I understand versus discretionary spending, or I call them frivolities actually. But I don't know that she was talking about individual and family essentials versus essentials in the infrastructure and governance too. And then when she gets to industrial, it throws me for a loop, because industrial, as far as I know, is just pump it out as fast as you can, make as much money as you can. It's not about optimizing anything but the bottom line. So I truly don't understand the question, unfortunately, but I tried.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we're winding this up. There's a few things in the chat that were good comments, where the people said they really weren't asking questions. I would like to ask Ted Manning to thank our speaker and to wind this up. Hope you're
Brian,
there.
we've got to stop meeting this way. Yeah, this is too interesting every time, and it's very useful for us to have these perspectives put in front. I'm a quintessential Canadian, the 6th or 7th generation. So I am learning every time I hear from the American approach and regulatory methods and constraints. I should let you know that one thing we have been doing recently with a number of members from the US ACOR, CACOR, and other parts of the Club of Rome is trying to redefine people's thinking about what they really want, and to wean them from the idea of GNP and have them focusing more on well-being and on identifying really what are the components of their lifestyle, of global lifestyle and shareable lifestyle, maybe even what their fair share is, which is for another day to talk about what is essential for survival. Anyway, it was very interesting to hear, and I would like to thank everybody else from coming from the US, from Britain, from all of the places who arrive here every week to learn something interesting. So thank you all for coming. We would like to give you a bit of the commercial for us to maintain this. We're well over 200 presentations going regularly every week. We do need funds, and therefore, for those of you who are not members or who wish to become members, we are very soon going to dun you for your annual contribution. We are also looking for new members who wish to participate in this kind of thing and in sharing ideas and impressions from different parts of the world. So again, thank you all for coming. If you do watch it on YouTube and share it, please do. And please sign up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So I would thank you again for coming, and thank you again, Brian. And we will definitely be staying in touch, because each time we talk, we learn interesting things from each other. So again, thank you all for coming. You can now hang around and talk to each other if you wish. We will be turning off the recording, and anything you didn't wish to say in front of the audience, you can now say.